Ever feel like the modern justice system is too soft? Community service, probation, maybe a few years behind bars. That's child's play compared to what people faced in the 16th century. Back then, punishment wasn't just about teaching a lesson. It was about making sure everyone in town remembered it for the rest of their lives, usually because they couldn't get the screams out of their heads. The 16th century took "don't do the crime if you can't do the time" and replaced time with torture that would make your ancestors cry. These weren't clean, quiet executions. They were public performances, spectacles of pain, designed not just to punish the guilty, but to terrify the innocent. And if you think you could somehow tough it out, grit your teeth, and walk away with dignity, trust me, you wouldn't survive. Let's walk through the grotesque menu of 16th century punishments that would break your body, your mind, and your will to live. Imagine standing in the town square, surrounded by your neighbors, when you're sentenced to the pillory. At first glance, it looks almost harmless, a wooden frame with holes for your head and hands. But this was no medieval photo booth. Once locked in, you were stuck there for hours, sometimes days, completely exposed. And the real punishment wasn't the wood, it was the crowd. People would throw rotten food, stones, and sometimes worse. Historical accounts mention hot coals, dead animals, and even human waste being hurled at prisoners. If you fainted, too bad. If you begged for mercy, the crowd got louder. By the time you were released, if you survived, you were bruised, broken, and humiliated for life. The pillory wasn't designed to kill you outright. It was designed to destroy your reputation, and in a world where your honor meant survival, that was often worse than death. But humiliation wasn't always enough. For thieves and liars, another popular punishment was branding. Authorities would take a red-hot iron, shaped like a letter, and press it into your skin. In England, an F might be burned into your cheek for forger, or a T for thief. Imagine walking around forever with a glowing neon sign etched into your face, announcing your crime to everyone you met. There was no second chance. You didn't just serve time, you carried your sentence everywhere you went, tattooed by fire. And without antibiotics or proper medical care, the risk of infection was massive. Some people didn't survive the branding iron, not because of the burn itself, but because of the festering wound it left behind. Now let's raise the stakes. In the 16th century, executions weren't simply about ending life. They were about sending a message in the bloodiest, most unforgettable way possible. Take hanging, drawing, and quartering, the ultimate punishment for treason in England. This wasn't one act, but a carefully choreographed sequence of agony. First, you'd be dragged on a wooden sled through the streets to the execution site, because walking with dignity was apparently too merciful. Then came the hanging, but not long enough to kill you. Just enough to choke, convulse, and teeter on the edge of death. Before you could slip away, you were cut down. Still alive, you'd be disemboweled. Yes, your stomach cut open, intestines pulled out, sometimes even burned in front of you while you watched. Finally, after your executioners were satisfied you'd suffered enough, they'd cut off your head and chop your body into 4 pieces, sending each quarter to different parts of the kingdom as a grisly warning. If that doesn't make your skin crawl, remember, this was a legal procedure, not an exception. For less political crimes, there were still endless ways to make sure you regretted ever being born. One of the most grotesque was the breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel. Picture being tied to a giant wagon wheel, while the executioner methodically smashed your arms and legs with a heavy iron bar, not just once, but repeatedly, shattering bones in multiple places. Your limbs were then threaded through the spokes of the wheel, like some kind of human pretzel, and you were left there to die slowly, exposed to the sun, birds, and the mockery of the crowd. Depending on how merciful or sadistic the executioner was, death could take hours, even days. Records show people surviving on the wheel for up to 3 days, drifting in and out of consciousness, their bodies mangled beyond recognition, And if you thought waterboarding was brutal, wait until you hear about the water torture of the 16th century. One method involved forcing prisoners to drink vast amounts of water, well past the point of pain. The stomach would swell, ribs would press outward, and breathing became nearly impossible. In some cases, funnels were shoved down throats, and water poured in relentlessly. Prisoners would convulse, choke, and often vomit violently, only for the process to start again. It wasn't about killing you, at least not right away. It was about stretching the limits of how much agony the human body could endure before it gave up. But water wasn't the only liquid weapon. In some places, boiling became a sanctioned form of execution. Convicted poisoners in 16th century England, under the reign of Henry VIII, could be punished by being boiled alive. Witness accounts describe the condemned being plunged into a massive cauldron of scalding water or oil, screaming as their skin blistered and peeled. Sometimes they were lowered slowly, prolonging the torture, their cries echoing through the square. And here's the chilling part. Crowds gathered eagerly for these events, not out of horror, but entertainment. People brought their children. It was a family outing to watch a man turned into soup. Not every punishment ended in death, but survival often came with a lifetime of scars. Take the scold's bridle, also known as the brank. This was a metal mask fitted over the head, with a spiked plate shoved into the mouth to press down on the tongue. It was used mostly on women accused of gossiping, nagging, or being disruptive. Once locked in, you couldn't speak, eat, or even move your jaw without piercing your own flesh. Some versions had bells attached, ensuring everyone knew you were being paraded through the streets. The message was clear. Silence wasn't just golden, it was mandatory, enforced by steel and blood. And then there was fire. Fire has always been humanity's oldest terror, and in the 16th century, it became the ultimate stage for public punishment. Burning at the stake was a punishment reserved for heretics, witches, and those who dared defy the church. Victims were chained to a wooden post, surrounded by bundles of dry wood. Sometimes the executioners lit the fire close, creating a quick, suffocating inferno. Other times, they stacked the wood farther away, letting the flames creep slowly upward, roasting the victim alive inch by inch. And yes, there are records of executions where damp wood was deliberately used to prolong the smoke and the suffering. For the audience, it was theater. For the condemned, it was hell on earth. But fire wasn't the only element harnessed for cruelty. Let's talk about iron. The iron chair was a device straight from nightmares. A solid metal chair covered with hundreds of sharp spikes. Prisoners were stripped, tied down and pressed into it, the spikes piercing flesh with every movement. Sometimes the chair was heated from below, turning it into a burning throne of agony. Imagine the sheer helplessness of sitting perfectly still while your skin blistered against scorching steel, knowing that even the smallest twitch only drove the spikes deeper. Executioners often left victims to languish for hours, their bodies slowly merging with the iron. The chair wasn't just about pain, it was about turning a human being into a grotesque display of living meat. And then there was flaying. Yes, exactly what it sounds like. Skinning a person alive. This wasn't just an ancient rumor. Flaying was documented well into the early modern period as punishment for treason or blasphemy. Victims were tied down while strips of their skin were carefully cut away, often starting with the face to ensure maximum horror for spectators. In some cases, the flayed skin was nailed to a wall as a warning. In others, it was displayed on city gates, a gruesome reminder of what awaited those who challenged authority. The body, robbed of its protective barrier, rarely survived more than a few hours. Death came from shock, blood loss, or infection, but never quickly. Not all punishments were about ending life. Some were about destroying your humanity while leaving you technically alive. Enter the stocks and whipping posts. Unlike the pillory, the stocks held you seated, your ankles locked in place. For hours, even days, you'd sit exposed, defenseless against the weather, insects, and the mockery of anyone passing by. Add in the whipping post, a sturdy wooden beam where criminals were lashed until their backs split open, and you had a recipe for public theater. Whipping wasn't a few lashes, it could be dozens, even hundreds. The whip often had knots or bits of metal woven into it, designed to tear flesh. Survivors carried scars like maps of their punishment, visible reminders of their shame. The ducking stool took humiliation into watery territory. Accused scolds, cheats, or suspected witches were strapped into a wooden chair attached to a long beam. Then, like a grotesque seesaw, they were dunked repeatedly into a river or pond. Imagine gasping for breath, choking on muddy water, freezing cold, while crowds laughed and jeered. Sometimes the goal was testing. If you drowned, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and dragged back up for more. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a public game of life and death, with rules that guaranteed you'd lose. And if you thought rats were just pests, the 16th century had other ideas. Rat torture was a particularly sadistic method documented across Europe. A cage containing a rat would be strapped against a prisoner's bare stomach or chest. Then the other end of the cage was heated, forcing the rat to burrow in the only direction it could escape, through the victim's body. The scratching, gnawing, and sheer terror made this one of the most psychologically devastating tortures ever devised. Death wasn't always the goal. Sometimes the mere threat of a rat cage was enough to break even the strongest will. Of course, the era also loved beheading, simple in concept, but far from merciful in practice. An executioner's skill determined whether it was quick or agonizing. A clean cut with a sharp axe or sword might end things instantly. But if the blade was dull, or the executioner nervous, it could take multiple swings. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was famously botched. It reportedly took 3 blows before her head was fully severed, and even then, the executioner lifted her head only for her wig to slip off, revealing her hair still attached to her scalp. The crowd was horrified, but this was reality. In the 16th century, even a merciful execution could become a nightmare. One punishment that blended pain with artistry was the Spanish garrote. At first glance, it looked almost mundane, a wooden chair with a metal collar around the neck, but once tightened, the iron ring crushed the throat or snapped the spine. Sometimes a sharp spike was positioned at the back, driven into the skull as the screw turned. Death could be swift if the executioner was merciful, or drawn out if he wanted to savor it. Unlike burning or breaking, the garrote was relatively quiet, a silent, suffocating death in front of a hushed audience. Spain used it for centuries, perfecting it as both execution and performance. For religious dissenters, punishments took on an especially grotesque symbolism. Tongue removal was common for those accused of blasphemy or heresy. Executioners used red-hot tongs to rip out or maim the tongue, silencing the condemned forever. Others had tongues pierced with spikes or locked in clamps, forcing them to bleed and choke if they tried to speak. In Protestant and Catholic territories alike, the message was the same: words could be more dangerous than weapons, and the mouth that uttered them could be destroyed. And we can't leave out the infamous thumbscrews. A small device, but devilishly effective. Iron bars with screws would be tightened around fingers or toes, crushing them slowly. Bones splintered, nails ripped off, blood seeped out. Victims screamed not from immediate death, but from the unbearable tension of knowing exactly what was coming with every turn of the screw. It was used for confessions, and unsurprisingly, people confessed to anything once their fingers were turned into pulp. In an age without forensic science, the thumbscrew was evidence enough. What makes all this even darker is how normalized it all was. These weren't hidden in dungeons or whispered about in secret. They were staged in public squares, marketplaces, and churchyards. Children were brought along. Merchants sold food nearby. Entire towns gathered to watch their fellow humans reduced to screaming bodies. For the authorities, it wasn't about sadism for its own sake. It was about order. Punishment had to be visible, unforgettable, and terrifying. Pain was currency, and the more brutally it was spent, the longer its memory lingered. Yet for all their variety, One thread connected them. Survival was never really an option. Whether you were branded, broken, boiled, or burned, the punishment followed you, in scars, in shame, or in the earth itself. The 16th century wasn't just a time of discovery and empire. It was an age when cruelty was codified, and justice carried an iron edge. If you thought spikes, fire, and rats were bad, brace yourself. The 16th century also had punishments so grotesque, they sound almost impossible, yet records confirm them. Let's start with one of the most stomach-turning: sawing. Picture this. You're tied upside down by your ankles, legs spread. A long wooden saw is brought out, the kind usually reserved for cutting timber. But this time, the log is you. Executioners would begin sawing between the legs, gravity ensuring you stayed conscious for as long as possible. Blood rushed to the head, keeping the brain alert even as flesh and bone split apart. In some regions, the sawing continued only halfway, leaving the victim to die slowly. In others, it went all the way through. Crowds didn't just watch, they applauded. Sawing was theater, and the condemned was the unwilling star of the most gruesome play imaginable. And if that doesn't make your skin crawl, let's move to the wooden horse, also known as the chevalet. At first glance, it looked like a harmless wooden beam shaped into a triangle, but the edge wasn't smooth. It was razor sharp. Prisoners were stripped and forced to straddle the beam, their entire body weight pressing down on a narrow edge that cut into flesh like a blade. Weights were sometimes tied to their feet to increase the pressure. Hours of this punishment meant torn groins, internal bleeding, and agony beyond description. It wasn't always fatal, but survival came at the cost of lifelong mutilation. The wooden horse was especially popular for military discipline, a reminder to soldiers that disobedience hurt far worse than any battlefield. The cruelty didn't stop there. Authorities also weaponized food and drink. The ordeal of poison was a trial used in some places to determine guilt. The accused was forced to swallow a test, sometimes a piece of consecrated bread, sometimes a concoction laced with toxins. If they survived without choking or falling ill, they were declared innocent, divinely protected. If they died, well, God had spoken. Imagine your innocence being decided not by evidence, but by your stomach's ability to withstand poison. Justice wasn't blind, it was drunk on superstition. And then there was the punishment of forced marches. Criminals, deserters, or prisoners of war could be shackled and driven on endless journeys under brutal conditions. No shoes, no rest, no mercy. Those who collapsed weren't helped. They were beaten, dragged, or left to die by the roadside. Surviving wasn't about strength alone. It was about enduring blistered feet, dehydration, and the psychological torture of knowing the journey had no end until your body gave out. In an age when even short travel was exhausting, being condemned to a march was like being sentenced to walk your life away. But some punishments leaned more toward spectacle. Take the brazen bull, a device older than the 16th century, but still whispered about in early modern Europe. Imagine a hollow bronze statue shaped like a bull. The condemned was locked inside, and a fire was lit beneath it. As the metal heated, the person inside roasted alive. Pipes were designed so that their screams echoed out of the bull's mouth, transformed into a sound like the bellowing of an animal. It wasn't just death, it was performance art of cruelty. While its actual use in the 16th century is debated, the fact that people still told stories about it shows how obsessed the era was with punishments that blurred the line between execution and theater. Speaking of theater, the executioner's artistry mattered. A skilled headsman could deliver a clean cut, but some went beyond necessity, turning punishments into elaborate displays. In Germany, there are records of executioners performing staged dances before carrying out beheadings, mocking the condemned. Others drew out the act with speeches, forcing the victim to wait in terror while the crowd was entertained. Justice wasn't efficient. It was a drawn-out ritual designed to make every witness think twice about breaking the law. Some punishments weren't about killing you, but about destroying parts of you. Mutilation was common. Thieves might have their hands chopped off. Adulterers could lose ears or noses. In some regions, blasphemers had lips or tongues seared with hot irons. The body became a billboard of crime, a living reminder that authority could mark you forever. And mutilation wasn't always neat. Primitive tools, infection, and lack of anesthesia meant many bled to death. Even those who survived carried wounds that never healed. Missing limbs, mangled faces, constant pain. Imagine living in a world where one mistake could literally cost you your hands. And then came punishments wrapped in religion. Ordeal by water wasn't just ducking. In witch trials, suspects were bound and thrown into a river or pond. If they sank, they were innocent, but dead. If they floated, they were guilty and burned or hanged afterward. It was the ultimate lose-lose situation. Across Europe, thousands faced this trial, their fates determined not by evidence, but by whether their bodies obeyed superstition. Some tried to tie themselves heavily, hoping to sink quickly and end it fast. Others fought to breathe, only to prove guilt by surviving. Justice once again was rigged from the start. And while we're on witchcraft, the witch's chair was another nightmare. It was a spiked metal seat, often submerged repeatedly into icy water. The spikes pierced skin while the cold robbed strength. Interrogators claimed it was just questioning, but the intent was clear: confess or suffer until death looked merciful. Many did confess, not because they were guilty, but because the pain erased the possibility of silence. But not all torture required elaborate devices. Sometimes the simplest tools were the cruelest. Take the boot. This was a wooden or metal frame fitted around the leg. Wedges were hammered in between the boot and the limb, crushing bones slowly with each strike. The victim's screams echoed across chambers as tibias splintered and muscles tore. Some boots used heated metal to cook the flesh from the outside while bones broke within. Survivors were left crippled, their legs permanently shattered. The boot was popular because it was portable, effective and terrifying, the perfect tool for interrogation. By now it's clear the 16th century didn't just punish, it choreographed suffering. Every execution, every torture, every mutilation was staged with an audience in mind. And the audiences weren't horrified, they were entertained. Children laughed, merchants sold refreshments, and ballads were written about particularly dramatic executions. Pain wasn't just a deterrent, it was part of culture. A grim reminder that in this era the line between justice and cruelty was so thin, it may as well not have existed. Some punishments were designed to kill, others to scar, but a few had only one goal: to terrify. Take public dismemberment. In parts of Europe, criminals could have fingers, ears, or even entire limbs hacked off in the middle of the square. Not only was it excruciating, it was immediate proof of guilt. Imagine walking through town for the rest of your life with one hand missing, every glance from strangers reminding you of the day your body became public property. Pain ended after a while, but the stigma never healed. And then there were the punishments so bizarre, they blurred the line between torture and ritual. In some cities, mock executions were staged. Prisoners were led to the scaffold, blindfolded, and made to believe their death was seconds away, only for the sentence to be revoked at the last instant. To modern minds that might sound merciful, but for the condemned, the trauma of believing you were about to die could leave lasting psychological scars. Heart pounding, breath quickening, prayers whispered, and then nothing. Survival didn't erase the memory of almost being erased. Of course, not every grotesque act was aimed at the body. Some went for the soul. Excommunication in the 16th century wasn't just a spiritual punishment, it was social death. You were cut off from the community, shunned by neighbors, denied burial in consecrated ground. In a world where faith was life's anchor, being cast out was like erasing your very identity. Some begged for physical torture instead, because pain was temporary, but losing your place in society was forever. And yet the strangest thing about all of this is how normalized it was. To us, the 16th century reads like a catalogue of horror, spikes, saws, fire, iron, humiliation. But to them it was order. It was stability. Punishments weren't whispered about in fear. They were written down in legal codes, announced by town criers, debated by scholars, and carried out by officials with ceremony. Pain was policy, cruelty was structured, and survival wasn't expected. Now here's the question that lingers: what does all of this say about us? Because the truth is, the instinct to punish through fear hasn't gone away. Our prisons may not use iron chairs or wheels anymore, but the idea of justice as spectacle, justice as humiliation, still lives on in headlines, in viral videos, in the court of public opinion. The 16th century may be gone, but the human appetite for punishment, that's eternal. So imagine yourself back in that square, surrounded by your neighbors. The executioner raises his blade, the crowd leans forward, and you realize there is no escape. At that moment, would you pray? Would you scream? Or would you stand silent, knowing that every second left was about to become someone else's memory? The grotesque punishments of the 16th century weren't just about ending lives. They were about writing stories in blood, stories meant to be remembered, and centuries later, here we are, still talking about them. Which means, in some twisted way, they worked. So now the question is yours. Which of these punishments do you think was the worst? The wheel, the stake, the saw, or maybe the silent torture of being branded and forced to live as a walking warning? Drop your thoughts below, because if history has proven anything, it's that conversation about cruelty never really ends.